Okay, let me tell you, I got involved in this so you understand what I'm doing here. In November, there was a meeting of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, a set of representatives of which I was one, the National Association of Clean Air Act Administrators, and the National Association of State Energy Offices. The meeting was with the brass of EPA, briefly with Gina McCarthy, who pointed out, among other things, that the Region 1 states that she'd been meeting with urged her to take a tough line with people like the West. There was also Jenna McCabe, who's the person whom the letter's directed, who's the assistant administrator responsible for the Section 111D, and Joe Goffman. This is strictly about Section 111D, and I should, so you understand my attitude about this. My job is to protect ratepayers. If a new coal-fired power plant's not getting built under Section 111B, that's not my problem because it's not going to affect ratepayers, at least directly, in any way that I can affect it. And the statute puts my agency in a position where we are always responding to initiatives taken by utilities. We don't take initiatives. So, from the beginning, I've been concerned about what happens to existing power plants. So looking around the room with this set of august folks, I realized that there's an awful lot of really warm and pleasant feeling for the EPA representatives from states like California, Maine, Colorado, and it reminds me of that old saying, if you don't know who the sucker is in the poker game, it's you. It was obvious that this was not the ideal place for a person like me. Nonetheless, Kentucky was there, and Kentucky spoke up. They had prepared a white paper, which I'm sure many of you have seen if you're interested in this material. Basically, Kentucky's plea was for more flexibility. Well, everybody was pleading for more flexibility, only what I could see as I was looking around the room was, if you're one kind of state, flexibility means there will be absolutely no pain for us from this. If you're another kind of state, you're thinking, if I get enough flexibility, maybe there's some way I can argue my way out of the worst of this. That would be Kentucky. Kentucky had argued for a mass-based approach to this. And down to the point where they were arguing that they ought to be in a position to plant more trees in Kentucky, because that might be one thing that they could count towards their greenhouse gas emissions. At some point I was moved to say something, and I said that Joe Goffman was taking questions, and I said, well, looking at Kentucky's paper, it says that Wyoming is supposed to conserve or to eliminate 46% of its greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. I said, my attitude about that is, you better have a federal implementation plan ready for that, because there's no way that I can see that anybody that's responsible for the state government is going to even attempt to comply with that, because it makes no sense for us. This was very kindly received, but it started a little dialogue that had some other moments that were somewhat comic. A guy from California suggested, for example, that he might be able to help our problem by putting in more wind that we can transport to California. How that reduces greenhouse gas in Wyoming, I honestly had no idea, but by that time, I'd already had my 30 seconds of fame or 10 minutes of fame, and I decided to move on from there. The result of this meeting was that I got a call from Joe Goffman's office saying that he and Jen McCabe would like to meet with me for 15 minutes at the next neighborhood meeting, which was 2 weeks later in Orlando. I went and talked to them. And we had a conversation about why it was I felt so strongly about why it would not work in the state of Wyoming. And I explained to them, I think it's all in the numbers. So I committed to them to put something in writing about that. What are some things that I know that they don't? Well, if you've seen the letter, and you can start leafing through the letter now if you have one in hand, one of the things that utility regulators have is access to basically books and records of the people specifically that we regulate, and that very specifically includes depreciation lives and the extent to which the plants are going to last. There is a line in the Section 111D that requires the EPA to consider the remaining useful life of the existing source to which the standard applies. At the time that I wrote the letter, it was not at all clear that there wasn't going to be some draconian effort to start closing down electric generation in the near future. And the reason it wasn't at all clear was because of the way that the NRDC letter that I just referred to was written. It essentially wanted the states to start ratcheting down greenhouse gas emissions by forcing the states to weed things, cull, if you will, cull out electric generators. So what I did, with the help of staff, was put together a letter that took that information and took the information that we have about recent cost of creating offsetting generation, and with that basis, put together a letter. There's a bottom line to this, but I'm going to come back and fill in the rest of it because there's more of a story to this that I was trying to convey. But the bottom line is, for Rocky Mountain Power, for example, if you shut down its fleet of coal-fired generation in 2020, that would be $3 billion of stranded assets, of which Wyoming's share would be 15.7%, or $471 million. The estimated cost of replacement power would be $6.9 billion, using the very reasonable number that they have for their new Lakeside unit. And Wyoming's share of that would be $1.1 billion. So you can run those numbers out, and if you do that, in Rocky Mountain Power's case, not trying to discount anything, it's just run the numbers out and see what's book depreciation is left. In 2035, it's down to $417 million and some change, and the cost of replacement power would be about $4.9 billion if you close those remaining plants down. Those numbers change because obviously in the meantime some things have worn out and you've replaced them. It's as simple as that. Okay? Now, those numbers don't really mean anything unless you have a context for them. So the rest of the letter talked about what's already was going on in Wyoming. And I'll talk about Kyle's company as well, but I'll talk about Rocky Mountain Power so it'll go a little faster. One of the things there's a chart in my letter that shows what rate increases we have granted Rocky Mountain Power since 2005. And as of roughly 2011, we had granted $200 million in rate increases. And one of the signal events of that year was that Rocky Mountain Power reported to us that one of their largest customers, I don't think it's a secret that it's ExxonMobil, had decided to self-generate. And in doing so, had taken with it 5% of the load in Wyoming. Okay? If you have a demand-side management program or an energy conservation program in the United States, and you can get 1 to 3% a year, you have a credible program. 5% is not such a good thing because the people that remain in the system have to pick up the rest of the tab. And when the system, as is in the electric industry right now, when the system's growth is slowing, some of the things that work for you are no longer working for you. So proposition number one in Wyoming, when you think of that $200 million and that's caused at least the first instance of rate shock, there have been, in their case, another $98 million of approvals for increases through, I think it's through 2016. Some of them were spread out to lessen the impact on ratepayers. If you toss on top of that the $471 million and $1.1 billion, it's obviously ludicrous to think this can happen. But wait, there's more. In addition to the rate increases we already had granted, we are also experiencing the effect of EPA's MATS rules, which shut down one of the plants in Utah. Note that if the plant gets shut down in Utah, it doesn't clean up the air in Wyoming. Nonetheless, Wyoming ratepayers are paying for it. Rocky Mountain Power is also building, I think I have the number here, it's like $671 million for a gas plant that's going into this cycle's rate case. And for the regional haze piece, Jim Bridger will, over the next while, be on the hook for roughly $800 million of regional haze improvements in the form of selective catalytic converters, something like that. SCRs, I'm not sure what the name is, but basically you're cleaning up the emission stream to affect regional haze. So we already have a lot of money being paid out of pocket to deal with problems in EPA. Already have a strain on the system. And to start talking about shutting down plants is, frankly, shocking. Making this more complicated, we have an arrangement with the other states in our region that are served by Rocky Mountain Power and Pacific Corp to allocate system costs. Okay? So that means that if there is a system cost, which is usually, you think, big transmission and big generation, it's divided up among the states. If it's something less than that, if it's what's called a situs cost, it is not. So that means when Rocky Mountain Power made improvements to the distribution system around Casper, creating a ring, in effect, a great improvement, that's a situs cost, not a system cost. There have been conflicts among the states that until recently had gotten along in terms of putting together a deal amongst themselves. There have been conflicts over whether energy conservation or demand-side management activities in one state would become system costs. So, Idaho, for example, last time around, was proposing that a demand-side management program for their irrigators, which had a 50% administrative cost attached to it, should become a system cost. And they sort of hinted that they would drop out of the arrangement if everybody else didn't buy it. It has to be unanimous. And we said, no, we don't pay anything. We never pay for any program that has a 50% overhead. Now, there's a little bit of history there, too, involving energy conservation. Many states have a legislature committed to demand-side management and energy conservation. Pass a statute that says that. They wind up with a commission that's committed to energy conservation. It tells their utilities that they want to see demonstrated energy conservation. We'll hire consultants that tell the utility what to tell the commission. They tell the commission says they've saved this much, the commission tells the legislature everybody's happy. Okay? There really isn't much examination of this because we've had people that come in front of us, and Kyle would know about this, where they come in, a consultant comes in and they say, well, we're going to deem this much in the way of savings from energy conservation. We say, you got to be kidding me, you haven't showed me anything, you've just made a pronouncement. We want to see how this is going to work. And pretty soon they get to, well, they accepted this in Colorado. And of course, that's not an answer for us because we don't have a legislature that's committed to that. Our only commitment is to make sure that the ratepayers that we're dealing with are essentially paying for something that's real as opposed to something that's deemed. So, just to give you another sense of that, invariably there's a light bulb program in these arrangements. Invariably you start pushing on it because what happens with light bulb programs, and I think they're valuable, otherwise I wouldn't be approving, but just to let you get a sense of why it is I'm suspicious about big numbers for energy efficiency. What happens is that when you push, the answer is, well, it's okay because the savings we've calculated, which we can't really prove, the savings we've calculated as the deemed savings, are savings we've discounted by 40%. Where'd you get the 40% discount from? Well, that's standard now in the industry. And that's kind of where you wind up. So naturally, one of the things that I'm not terribly in favor of is starting to make a system asset out of other people's energy efficiency. Okay, keep that thought in mind. And then the last thing that I need to talk about is system design concerns. There was just a report released that's supposed to support the idea that EPA's changes won't affect system reliability. I had one of my engineers look at it. We both agreed that it was a political scientist explanation and not an engineer's explanation for why it is you could remove very large base electric generation and not have a problem. And it has to do with cooperation among states. From what you've just heard about from me, you can figure out that I'm not as sanguine about states cooperating, particularly if it gets down to the point where you guys start shutting down greenhouse gas emissions or having real pain to do it. All right. So as Tom said, I've been talking to Joe Goffman on and off after this letter at various forums. And I'd just like to share you with a couple of things that we had been talking about. One of the things that came up in Portland was the idea that the program that they would eventually be putting together would probably, by this time they had evolved to being hinting that they wouldn't be demanding immediate shutdowns. However, he did say that when the EPA has done that in the past, they've usually demanded some kind of, something he referred to as a down payment. So the discussion was about, as you can well imagine, wait a second, we're just about to pay $800 million for regional haze. What kind of a down payment do you need? Thank you very much. We're shutting down, Black Hills Corp shutting down a plant, Pacific Corp shutting down a plant. It seems like that ought to qualify the down payment. And later on in the conversation, Todd, I think Todd was there for, I know it's not there for this. They got to talking about other measures that might be taken, and I just thought and said, if you're going to do this, please don't make our utilities sort of derate their plants or do something to throttle back what you're actually getting out of the plant on the theory that this is going to help greenhouse gases. In other words, don't just make people spend millions of bucks for no good reason other than eyewash. If these things have useful lives, let them be useful and let the companies run them the way they ought to be run. Consistent with the rest of the regulations. That is, you got your MATs, you got your regional haze, whatever deal was made about that, fine. But let's not start adding on the notion, adding on these other fill-ups. And the reason that I think that's a real concern is, guess what? Several months ago, the same group that I was talking about, this time I wasn't there because actually I have a job, so I can't go into these things. They're meeting with a group of people representing big engineering companies who have big ideas about how to make efficiency improvements that would potentially reduce carbon emissions. That's all well and good, depending on the price. But frankly, I didn't like the feel of it. A bunch of big companies getting together with a bunch of people like me in Washington and talking about how they wanted an inside track of doing this. So that's another problem. Next problem that we talked about was whether the states would readily cooperate. And I think this also came up in Portland. I think the other commissioners that were there agreed that it took years to get together the multi-state protocol that allocates costs for the Pacific Corp. Years. To say that we should immediately assume the states could get together on something like that is obviously not very wise, I think. And I have to say I'm less sanguine than they might otherwise be about being able to do it at all, and maybe on short notice. One of the other tensions we're feeling in our group of Pacific Corp states is that Oregon and Washington are getting more aggressive about insisting on the retirement. In Oregon's case, they've changed the depreciation date, so Pacific Corp's keeping two sets of books, effectively, about early retirement of coal generation. The last is the reliance on energy efficiency. The one part I didn't tell you about in my letter was that Wyoming exports roughly 2/3 of the electricity it generates. Okay? And virtually all of the IOUs in our state are configured so that they largely serve industrial loads or commercial loads, like Microsoft out here, that look a lot like industrial loads in terms of being 24/7. So that means that, first of all, it means that there's a lot of things that people normally do with demand-side management or energy conservation that simply don't work here. Because normally, the first place that people look to conserve is in the residential side. So if you have a company like Pacific Corp that has a 15% residential load, and you have every customer they have take out all their light bulbs, no one will notice. I mean, it's Wyoming, maybe even the people that are customers won't notice it, but basically it's too small an increment to make any sense or any difference. So part of our problem is, as long as we're exporting this much, unless you can figure out some way to also allocate that to other states, some way that EPA will enforce on a mandatory basis, I honestly don't see other states stepping up to do that. I see other states wanting to basically leave coal as kind of somewhere in an energy backyard somewhere and not really address it. Meanwhile, holding themselves out as being committed to our energy future. And I guess I'd put Oregon in that camp. Todd said he didn't want to sort of pick any fights, but we get along with people in Oregon okay. But I think it's pretty clear that they want to change the way we're doing business and actually want to change the way the multi-state protocol runs. One of the things that I don't want to do is start buying Oregon's calculation of its energy efficiency, naturally enough, for the reasons I just told you. Earlier this week, the same three groups I was telling you about got together with EPA and issued a release saying that they had come to agreement with EPA on some principles for energy efficiency usage in the context of Section 111D. And they want EPA to recommend the use of, and there's a list of standards, but at least I haven't gone back and drilled through all of them, but the ones that I'm familiar with are not standards. They are the thing you exercise some judgment that might have a 40% discount. If that's the terms on which I'm dealing with other states, that's fine. If somehow it's a big enough loophole for me to get our 35% use and 65% use that we sell outside under it, that's fine. But I don't think it is. I don't think that's what's going to come out of this. I think it's going to wind up being flexible enough for some states to get out, but probably not us. So we're looking at a situation where I think our best position going in is that EPA honors the plain language of the statute and allows us to have essentially the run of the useful lives of the plants we have here. If they do that, obviously, then time passes, the political tumblers can change, and the outlook may change. But I think we're one of the few few states that are in a position as the one like the one I just described. And I think it portends some interesting times in front of us, starting on about June 2nd. And I think, as Tom said, Joe has agreed to be here next time around, so we'll get a chance to talk about that. So.
Covering a very large topic. So I'd like to shift this over to Lyle now to give us a perspective from an affected utility that covers a wide area out here in the West. Basin's a big deal. They've been spending a lot of time looking at carbon. They are trendsetters, and he'll share some of that activity going all the way back to what used to be called the Great Plains Project. Now it's something else. But give us your perspective, and most particularly what Basin is looking at and how they're approaching the consideration of this rule.
So Lloyd, how much time do we have left? Okay. Well, again, thank you to the board for inviting us and Basin Electric to be part of this. We have two big coal facilities in the state. We're 42.7% owner and the operator of Laramie River Station, which is a 1,710 megawatt facility. And we also have the newest coal-based facility in Wyoming, the Dry Fork Station, which is a 440 5 megawatt net facility that went commercial in November 2011. And I had kind of I have a presentation that basically covered the same points that Todd covered. So I'm not going to go through that presentation and recover the things that Todd covered. I'm going to basically kind of talk about the practical side and the impacts of that on our facilities and some of the issues that what's going on and how it's affecting us in particular, and also how it will probably affect Wyoming, because it's the same issues that we're dealing with will be the same issues that everybody's dealing with. Really the topic of our is impact on ratepayers, and as Lee Bowie said, Tri-State is a sister generation and transmission cooperative. That means we generate wholesale power. We are owned by the people we sell the power to. We are not regulated by Allen's folks. Our board set our rates, and our jobs are basically, and I'm the environmental manager for Basin Electric, but what the board wants us to do is provide reliable and affordable electricity to our customers. And these regulations that are presenting a challenge to do that. And in any when our board sets the rate, they basically provide power at cost. We're not for profit, and the cost basically includes the cost of operating the plant and then your capital costs. And the operation costs, so your primary costs are your fuel, and the cheapest on a BTU per BTU basis, the cheapest fuel available is coal. That remains the case, even when gas was at under $3 per decatherm here a year and a half ago or so. Our mine mouth coal at Dry Fork was still about 2/3 of the cost of natural gas in terms per BTU basis. Dry Fork, the Energy Information Agency comes out with ratings of plants in terms of operational costs every year. And Dry Fork Station last year was the second lowest operational cost in the country. That's primarily because it's a mine mouth facility, and the coal that comes out of that mine mouth facility, thanks to Mike's folks that supplies the coal, is very, very inexpensive, and because of the thick coal seams and the thin overburden in Wyoming and the low sulfur content. That's why Wyoming sells so much coal to other parts of the country. And then you have your labor costs, and then your other major cost is your capital cost. Our Dry Fork facility was a $1.3 billion investment. It didn't start out there, but at the time we were building it, the price of steel and other things between 2007 and 2009 went way up. So it ended up being a $1.3 billion project. But and then that's how many years under our loan agreements, how many years you can amortize that is a big part of your capital cost. So the issue that Alan's talking about, remaining useful life, is a fundamental issue. Now, on our Laramie River station, Todd talked about the difference between the state implementation plan and the federal implementation plan get to almost exactly the same place for controlling NOx emissions from our facilities in Wyoming, and a $500 million difference. And then he expressed his frustration that, well, the numbers have changed because EPA looked at different numbers. Under regional haze, EPA, if you look at the statute, the regional haze statute, that says EPA is supposed to set a rate of emissions for regional haze. They did that in 2005 for our Laramie River station. They set a presumptive rate of emissions from Laramie River at 0.23 pounds per million BTUs. And then we went through several years of negotiations with the state in establishing what the NOx emissions should be for that facility, and they established a state implementation plan. The numbers that they asked us to meet, we reached an agreement on, were significantly below that 0.23. It was basically a 0.19 pounds per million BTU. And then they asked us to put those controls on right away, not wait until the 5 years, but put them on right away. And the state implementation plan was implemented, and we started putting those controls on. And those are combustion controls, and that ended up, we're doing the last round of under the state implementation plan of the low NOx burners for Unit 3 now, and that's another $20 million. And each of those over-fire air and low NOx burners, each of those was about a $20 million a shot for each of those technologies, and we did that over-fire air 2009 on Unit 1, 2010 on 2, 2011 on 3, and then low NOx burners 12 on 1, 13 on 2, and now we're putting the low NOx burners on Unit 3 at Laramie River. That's about a $120 million investment, and we're far exceeding that level that the state asked us to get to, that 0.19. We're operating about 0.15, 0.16. We traditionally are at about 0.30, which was about 60%, or we're about 40% below what our permit required us to emit on average. So we were emitting all those years, and this facility was built, so it was built with back level controls, best available control technology on it. So anyway, we operated all those years below our permit, and now we're at about half reduction. The EPA comes back and says, no, we want you to read a 0.07 now, instead of 0.23, which they came up with in their rule. And then and the bottom line is the technology now, under our current evaluation, is going to cost us $750 million, which is about $450 million than when we did the evaluation in 2007. The numbers that Todd is working with, EPA and their federal implementation plan actually agreed with most of what we said, and their numbers, if you add it up for the 3, is about $590 million, which is, so anyway, but when you look at these things together, so now we have to make a decision on, do we put this $750 million investment on this facility, knowing, and one of the fundamental, under the Clean Air Act in 1977, there were 3 amendments that came out that gave state primary authority over 3 areas. The 70 amendments dealt with health-related standards, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. 77 amendments were non-health related standards, and one was for best available control technology in areas in attainment of the NACs, and that primary authority given to states on that, and it covers energy costs energy costs and costs of the controls, basically. And those are 2 elements they put in back. They put the same elements in determining for regional haze what the reduction was, but they also put in regional haze consideration of the remaining useful life of that facility. So in our disagreement with EPA, they're using a 20-year period now for Laramie River Station for that life of that facility in determining their cost per ton number. Now, are we going to, now under this new rule that's coming out for existing sources, are we going to be able to operate at 20 years? That's a fundamental question. This remaining useful life and how long we have to depreciate it is going to have a fundamental impact on how much our customers are going to have to pay for electricity out of our facilities. And that's $750 million there, plus and one of the things on all these regulations come out is as Lee said in his presentation, it's all a matter of risk. Are the regulations going to change? If we make the investment to improve efficiency, that's one way to make reductions under whatever the rule is. The other way would be to make investments for offsets, so you might invest in wind and offset your emissions from the coal, like the Reggie states are doing. Colorado, the Wyoming and North Dakota we've got a lot of wind resources, and we want that to be one of our options. Basin Electric has built a lot of wind resources. So how all these are going to work together under this rule that's coming out for existing sources is going to be fundamental. And that's kind of the main points I wanted to cover, other than on the partial CCS issue. Our DGC facility, our Dakota Gasification, has sequestered for enhanced oil recovery 25 million tons of CO2. That's been win-win for the oil companies in Canada that buy the CO2 from us. They have gotten much more return than what they pay for in terms of oil barrels produced compared to what they pay for our CO2. There's a tremendous opportunity in both Wyoming and other oil-producing states in the upper Midwest to do the same thing in our states, especially the Bakken area in North Dakota. I'd like, if you have questions on that, I'd love to elaborate. But, and then our second example I want to use, anyway, but EPA's, as Todd talked about, EPA's is saying basically that the remaining useful life is not remaining useful life, they said partial carbon capture is an available technology. And that is like saying that the body parts for Dr. Frankenstein had available, if you sew them together, as an available technology, because there's no working plan that has all of those things together. And that's the fundamental flaw in what EPA is doing. And if you have questions on that, I'd love to answer them. We also explored doing on a pulverized coal plant right beside DGC with the pipeline available for us, and customers on that pipeline doing a carbon capture project on that facility, 100 megawatts slipstream. The main thing is it's about a third, you're going to have a third of your energy under the current technology that's going to be a parasitic load for carbon capture. That's a fundamental problem. When you figure that in, and all the other things, and the costs of the technologies that we looked at in our front-end engineering design study, that cost of that technology was going to be at least $500 million for that $100 million slipstream. That is confirmed by the Sask Power Boundary Dam project that the Canadian government is largely funding right across the border from North Dakota. They've got a 110 megawatt pulverized coal facility, and right now for that facility is supposed to start this spring. It's $1.2 billion plus already invested on that. So that's any application of that technology, those capital costs are going to make coal not able to compete. So.
Thank you, Lyle. I'd like to, again, in the interest of time, to try to pose a number of questions for both Al and for Lyle. And the first one would be as follows. We know that the rule addressing new power plants suggests a standard of something on the order of 1,100 pounds per megawatt hour, which is, I think, equivalent to the cleanest natural gas-fired combined cycle facility. One does not expect that for existing plant that the rule will go that deep, but it has been suggested that possibly something on the order of 1,900 or 2,000 pounds per megawatt hour. Here's the question for both of you. If that was the standard, how might that affect, and I'll ask Al first because he knows the Wyoming power plants, how might that affect Wyoming's existing power plants if that standard was required?
I don't know. I think the first thing we do would be to ask the utilities what happens. I think that's the only thing we can do.
Well, then I'll ask Lyle that question. How might that affect Basin's plan if that was the state?
Right now, our Wyoming facilities are in the range of 2,200 to 2,300 pounds per megawatt hour. And we've already done lots of efficiency improvements on several of those plants, and Dry Fork is our new facility that's a little under 2,100. There's no possible way we could meet it 1,900 pounds per megawatt hour standard inside the fence. So the only way you could possibly do that would be some kind of offsets outside the fence with wind and other options. And one of the fundamental things when the rule comes out to look at is what kind of standard it's going to give the states the flexibility to have. And because of our load growth in the Bakken, we have tremendous, we've got 2,000 megawatts that we're going to have to build over the next 20 years, 1,000 in the next few years. Plus, we have 3,000 megawatts of coal that we own that provides our fundamental baseload power. So how are we going to be able to, with load growth, how are we going to be able to continue to operate those? And if on a rate-based, if you're in a state or in a region with increased load, it's almost impossible to reduce the mass of your emissions. It is possible to reduce the rate of your emissions by bringing on new resources that are very low carbon intensive, wind and gas combined cycle, or gas simple cycle. Combined, you can probably have a rate of 500 to 600 pounds per megawatt hour between those two types of resources. And if you average it across your system, then you could probably make a reduction across your system to meet something like that. So is the rule in states and facilities going to allow that? On older facilities where you almost want to have a mass-based system, because the easiest thing to do to reduce emissions from those is simply to back them down during low growth periods and use wind or something else. So if that's an option, then a mass-based system may not be so painful if you can average it across, if it's a mass-based system rather than a 1,900-pound rate-based number. So the difference between rate and mass is going to be huge. I don't think the states have thought through this issue very much. I don't think but that's going to be a fundamental issue that industry is going to have to bring to the states and to EPA. And we have had those discussions. I have had that discussion with Mr. Goffman, for example, a couple of times. So.
Again, for both of you, another issue that's been talked about, and Al referenced it, and so did Todd, and that is that a number of facilities are going to be subjected to considerations associated with regional haze and the compliance requirements therein. In the conversations, Al and Lyle, that you've had both with the states, your brethren in the industry, and EPA, can you share with the audience and the board any consideration on how those kinds of costs could be grandfathered if, as an example, you move forward to comply with regional haze? Could some of those costs be grandfathered as we move towards compliance with Section 111?
I haven't had a conversation like that with anyone. It seems to me that the SCR technology, as I understand it, isn't geared to taking out CO2. So if it's not geared to taking out CO2, I don't think there's really any nexus between the two, to be honest with you. The main discussions we've had about the technology of that nature is how expensive it is and whether or not that's enough of an ante to show that we're proceeding in good faith.
I think they're not linked. Well, they're very closely linked for the reason I discussed. And the LRS example, I think, is really pertinent. We have to make the federal implementation plan basically requires us to make that $750 million investment, give or take $50 million, and have that technology installed 5 years after the federal implementation came out in March of this year. So we have until March of 2019 to get 3 SCRs on those 3 units at Laramie River at $750 million. At the same time, this rule is going to come out, and under EPA is using a 20-year depreciation period for those SCRs to get the cost low enough so that they can justify requiring us to put them on. Are they going to allow us then to run that plant 20 years beyond that time under 111D? That's a fundamental question. What's the answer?
I think it would be useful to turn this over to the audience, but start with the board. We have, Lloyd tells me, about 7 or 8 minutes. And I'd suggest that, Mr. Chairman, you might start off with some questions for both Lyle and for
I guess more just a comment. Thank you guys for your time and the information that you shared. It's pretty informative. And I guess the leadership the chairman has shown on this issue is pretty compelling. You know, when you have people like Joe Goffman that speak highly of how Wyoming is representing itself on the issue, it does give us a seat at the table and does allow us to have the meaningful negotiations that we have to get to in order to try to manage the risk that we're facing. So thank you for your leadership, Mr. Chairman. I don't really have any questions, but I just wanted to make the panelists know we appreciate their thoughts on it.
Maybe just a comment on some of the information that was shared about the costs of upgrades in the period of time with which to recover those costs from customers. Probably those costs exceed the costs of the power plants when they were originally constructed, and they had an opportunity to be recovered over twice the period of time. Then you're going to be allowed, or hopefully allowed, under current EPA regulations. And so it's basically a mathematics problem for customers. And you've got too much cost over too short a period of time and no good alternatives to be cost effective for solutions. So just a comment.
Al, I just want to comment on, you mentioned your staff when you're writing the paper. Just read the North American Electricity Reliability Council issued their reliability assessment in December. And in that, they indicated with the high likelihood of large shutdowns, early retirements of coal power plants, taking that inertia of those spinning steam turbines or generators is going to cause reliability and stability problems on the grid. So it's one of your comments you mentioned. They're predicting that new other technology solutions need to be put in because the renewables do not provide that stability or dispatchable reactive power or capabilities to keep grid voltage and frequency stability. So that's a pending problem that I think remains to be addressed.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
Are the people who are this is Gene Freeman from the University of Colorado, are the people who were making the decision to go to self-generation subject to the same rules as far as emissions are concerned?
Todd, that, because we don't see them once they
There's
start.
not. The motivation for large industrial users to convert to their own generation is very great, and that could have a huge impact on stranded assets and rates.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons, I mean, in my mind, with a heavy industrial load, you're talking about the key reason for not being careful about how much you're raising rates at any given time, any given period.
As these assets go online to address the emissions issues, the rates are going to go up to cover the fixed costs and depreciation and all the other things associated with that, which is a greater impetus for large industrial users to go to self-generation. And if they're not exposed to those same rules, most of them are probably going to go to gas-fired generation, which starts out at a lower level. But I think there's likely to be a trend for more and more large industrial users to go to their own sources, which is going to have a huge impact on rates.
There's one offset here that you should be aware of. Under an agreement entered into in a recent rate case with Rocky Mountain Power, we now have a certificate of public convenience and necessity process that applies to all the new big pollution equipment. Basically, the complaint that was made by the industrial energy consumers was that by the time somebody spent $500 million on something, the likelihood of us disapproving it gets to be fairly small. They wanted us to look at these things in advance. So as a result of that, we have a process that involves using modeling of Pacific Corp to decide whether it's still sensible to add pollution controls to the coal facilities as opposed to building new gas facilities. As a result of that, a decision was made to convert and effectively retire not Unit 3 and make that gas, but the SCR units on Bridger, the 4 Bridger units are still more cost effective than alternative gas generation. I think as long as there's a reasonable margin from that, a reasonable value is still coming out of the existing plants, the numbers work out. Because remember, the $800 million is not going all Wyoming, it's a system asset.
I guess, Lloyd, do we have any time for any more questions from the audience?
Questions from the audience?
I'm Dale Osborne of MISO. One of the questions I have is the people that go off on their own to self-generation, are they disconnecting from the reliability support from the rest of the system, and are they paying for it?
I think the answer is, I think they're still hooked up, and I think they are paying for it. I can't tell you what the terms are of having that reliability backup.
Because that reliability backup is probably worth 2 or 3 of their generators.
I would just refer it to the utility. I don't have that on the top of my head.
Other questions?